We've had an excellent 24 hours and 5 minutes at this year's Global Strategic Review. So far, we've heard from ministers, from politicians, from analysts, from members of the media, and this session is an opportunity for the voice of business to be heard. And the idea here was to have 3 business leaders talk about how they think of geopolitical risk and how, therefore, in effect, they consider the requirement for geopolitical due diligence. And it's been our view at the IISS for some time that the views from the private sector are important, but they're important also specifically in this area of how to understand political and geopolitical risk. Big businesses have for 3 decades understood that for their successful engagement in foreign societies and on the international scene, they have to embed themselves in the societies of the countries in which they're engaged and adopt an attitude that fully embraces the tenets of corporate social responsibility. But our own view is that the world has become so complex, and the ability of businesses to rely on their host governments or on the governments from which they hail is so tenuous that big business and indeed medium-sized businesses have to develop something close to a foreign policy attitude in order properly to engage in the international space, develop alliances, promote their interests, understand the oppositions that may be at play, and not rely only on the governments from which they hail or the governments with whom they are dealing in order to ensure that they are successful. And these requirements are imposed on all sorts of different types of businesses. I remember speaking to a very senior executive at the Brazilian firm Vale, who noted that their engagement in Mozambique is such that the annual expenditure of Vale in Mozambique is the same as the annual expenditure of the Mozambican government. About $6 billion a year. And so when you have a co-equal role in investing in society as the government, the nature of your engagement in that society is important. When you're building a $2 billion railway across Mozambique that might also cross Malawi, that affects in a very material way the contribution that one is making and requires you to have a specific engagement with society. You cannot always necessarily count on your host government for your support. Sometimes your host government might be a liability. I think of the case of Carrefour in China, which suffered for a while when the then president of France had an engagement with a political personality that China felt was not right. And as a consequence, there was all sorts of demonstrations in Beijing and other cities against Carrefour until Carrefour had to say that we employ 35,000 Chinese. We're a Chinese company. If you damage us, you damage yourselves. And then they stopped. What did Carrefour have to do? They had to deracinate themselves from their home country in order to be successful. But you also have to find other ways to develop allies. I remember speaking to a European head of a major oil company from a country that was a member of the UN Security Council, and they were investing in Iraq, and he was saying to me, well, actually, we're going to also do a JV with a Chinese company. I said, why do you need to do a JV with a Chinese company? You've got the resources, you've got the technology. And he looked at me as if I was an idiot and said, we need a second UN Security Council vote. Thank you very much. So those are the types of foreign policy attitudes that a number of companies have, and I wanted to understand, and I hope you would wish to understand, what the current perceptions are of the business community in this space. And I'm going to ask each of the 3 speakers to speak for about 7 minutes, and then we'll have a dialogue with the audience. And I'll first introduce them and ask them to speak in order. We've got Marilyn Hirsch from the United States, who's the head of strategy for the enormous insurance group AIG, that is a global power in the insurance industry. We have John Knight, member of the executive board of Statoil, one of our sponsors at this event. And we have Andrés Rozental, who has a variety of business interests, including being on the board of ArcelorMittal in Mexico, HSBC, and also Wilson Sons, a major maritime port services and container services company in Brazil, so has to think of these decisions all the time. So I'll invite them to speak in that order, and then we'll have a dialogue. Marilyn, how does AIG think about geopolitical risk?
Thank you very much, John. I just want to start out by saying it's both an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. Allow me to take a few moments just to give you some background and give you some context from where I'm pulling my experiences and my observations. If you hadn't heard about AIG before September of 2008, certainly 6 years ago, maybe not to the day, but certainly close to it, American International Group became a household word in many, many places around the world, not the least of which was in the United States. The company went from being a $182 billion market cap company overnight to being worth, if not pennies on the dollar, something close to it. And to give you an idea of the size and the magnitude of the loss, yesterday, Alibaba closed its first day of trading on the New York Stock Exchange at about almost exactly the same market capitalization. So that was that. By 2012, the management of AIG had managed to repay the US taxpayer over $100 billion. And then in addition to that, almost $22 billion of profit. In order to do that, a number of the very famous and very successful international life businesses had to be sold. And the company did a re-IPO and was therefore able to repay the government. So what does that mean today? Today, AIG is about an $80 billion market cap company. We operate in about 90 countries, more than 90 countries. It's an approximation. We keep count, it's roughly 90 countries around the world. We're about $60 billion of revenue, 63,000 people serving 90 million customers, both individuals and commercial businesses around the world. So I think it's safe to say that we're a pretty complex business. Our new CEO likes to say that we sell everything from life insurance on cows in India, it's true, to satellites. And so the complexity that John mentioned is inherent in everything that we do. So that's the background. One last thing, AIG, you may know or may not know, was founded in Shanghai in 1919 on the Bund. And it was only many, many years later that the founder, C.V. Starr, and some of his management team actually purchased a bunch of insurance companies in America and grew that to be actually the largest business that we have in the world today. Okay, so the next part is, before I make my next comments, I actually want to state for the record, we actually have a very stable and good business around the world. Having said that, if you look back over the last 12 to 18 months, it's been absolutely remarkable how much political risk, maybe not surprising, but surprisingly to us, has emanated out of our core operations. And from a very diverse group of events and circumstances that created the dislocation in the market and to our operations that we felt. And I'm talking about in Egypt, in the Ukraine, even in Russia. In the spring, it was in Thailand. And even when the events themselves didn't cause disruption to operations, gave us some pause. All of you may remember there was potentially some social unrest in Brazil, and we have a large and growing organic business there. So just the number and the diversity of events has caused us to have very real-time evaluation of political risk in our business. The other interesting thing is, even if it's not a specific interruption to our business and serving our customers, the concept of extraterritoriality is something that's been emerging over the last year or so. And when geopolitical issues arise on a bilateral or multilateral basis, and don't cause disruption to our operations. Nevertheless, there may be perceived changes in regulation and other business environment issues that we may feel over the course of a longer extended period of time. Those are all the negative things. But on the flip side of it, I think geopolitical risk can actually present some really interesting opportunities for us. And despite the discussion earlier today in this room, one of the most interesting opportunities could come out of a normalization of relations with Iran from our perspective. 75 million people, well-educated. It'd be really interesting from our perspective to be able to ensure their lives and their possessions. And a country so rich in natural resources, we would want to help build an insurance infrastructure to help that business thrive on an international basis. So my last observation brings me back to China. We were the first foreign insurance company to be granted a wholly owned license in 1990, and then we established a partnership with one of the largest insurance companies in China in 2002 and created a joint venture with them, which has turned out to be very, very successful. And maybe this isn't the way people would normally think about geopolitical risk, but with every successive 5-year plan, and our partner being a state-owned enterprise, so being, if not responsible for, certainly expected to help realize the vision in those 5-year plans. And with China becoming an increasingly global player in the global stage, we now have to face the reality that our partner locally in China is increasingly going to become our competitor internationally. And understanding that it doesn't emanate from a corporate desire, but it's really a realization of all of China realizing, probably the #1 market position in terms of GDP over the next 10 years, gives us perspective on how to deal with our relationship. How much will we be able to influence it? Should we partner, continue to partner? How do we continue to partner in the face of all that? So lots of things for us to ponder as we do the global walk around the world. And there's lots of other things we could talk about, but I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you very much. John Knight, a Statoil view of how you've developed your thinking on geopolitical due diligence.
Well, John, I think we started to fundamentally reevaluate how we looked at geopolitical risk in the summer of 2010, and we've made quite a lot of changes to corporate governance, leadership, cadre, business process since then on the back of those considerations. What sparked that reconsideration was partly we were approaching the 10-year anniversary of our IPO. We're 67% owned by the Norwegian state, and the other 33% is quoted on the New York and Oslo stock exchanges. As we approached that anniversary, we started to think about what our strategic restatement would be. And one of the questions that arose there was, what are the frame conditions of the next decade compared to the last decade? What sort of changes do we have to make? And many of us felt, having read books like The Age of the Unthinkable and by Joshua Cooper Ramo and Black Swans and all that sort of thing, having just lived through what was still quite a foggy area in the financial crisis, and specific to the oil industry, still being in the middle of the fog, perhaps we still are, on the implications of the very fast development in US unconventional business, which has many geopolitical as well as industrial implications. Many of us felt that this was a distinctively volatile mega VUCA period, but others of us felt, well, it's oil, it's political, it's a commodity, it's volatile. The terms of trade change every 5 or 10 years through technology development. It's always like this, isn't it? But I think eventually we concluded that no, what we were facing the next 10 years is materially different. And this sort of audience will be aware of the reasons for that, the multipolarity, the rise of the East, interconnectedness, etc. So essentially, I would say the way we strategized, and I put geopolitical risk as an element in strategization, was really epiphenomenon of capital budgeting over 5 years. It was done by finance department. And you could, if you represent the future like that, you could, with reasonable care, identify a number of scenarios and sort of prepare your portfolio for them. But in this mega VUCA world, which we've just been through a couple of examples I gave, really our view of the future was sort of flatter. It was higher degrees of uncertainty and much less visibility. And planning and forecasting becomes much more difficult. So how do you relate to it? And I would say that we developed a new sort of management mindset and doctrine behind different processes of strategization that were more to do with optionality, resilience, and agility. If you put some words around a lot of actually quite structural changes. Just a couple of words on what happened since the summer of 2010 for a company like ours in our industry. Well, you know, the full implications of Macondo started to happen. A relatively straightforward well, leading to the speedy decline and almost lack of liquidity of a very large entity. We also had a number of unthinkable terrorist attacks here, not very far from this building, the Breivik atrocity, known for the killing of all the young people, but actually it blew up the energy department and the Prime Minister's office. It looked, as it unfolded, it looked something different to what it ended up being. Of course, the In Amenas attacks, which is a BP and Statoil Sonatrach-operated plant. And in the area of connection of geopolitics to safety and security, one of the main lessons we learned was, apart from speed of events, was that really security is not something that you can embed within an industrial safety from an industrial process point of view. It has to have different doctrines, different work processes, different leadership, different management attention, different key performance indicators. So we've made a lot of structural changes around that. I can go into that in more depth later if people are interested. Then, with regard to geopolitics, a lot of multinationals around the end of the 90s set up corporate country risk analysis offices. A couple of political scientists, usually from the host nation, embedded fairly deeply into maybe the third echelon of management, looking at the dynamics of repatriation of currency, nationalization risk, and that sort of thing, a commercial link to to domestic politics. But when you look at a thing like the In Amenas attack, it looks as if it was an Algerian event, but of course it was conceived in Mali and directed from Mali and mustered in southwest Libya. So, you know, the need to put real emphasis into transnational regional analysis, and then further than that into global geopolitical analysis. So we relocated our so-called country risk analysis, gave it 3 tasks: country risk, transnational risk, and then those geopolitical elements which change the security threat picture. So 3 jobs, differently constructed, placed differently in the organization. And then a final remark I'd make would be about how we strategized. It was not a conversation had at the same time as the 3 to 5 year capital expenditure plan. It was taken out of that environment and put into a less metricized environment, more inquisitive environment. We put in place a lot of structures to make sure that our strategization was more frequent, agility, speed, and that final point, John, with much more interconnection and regular interconnection, depth of connection with the outside world. It was only since then that Statoil joined IISS. I'll say I was a member before that. We also set up, as part of that externalization, something we call the Strategic Advisory Committee, smaller than most, meeting 3 times a year, 6 people, chaired by Sir John Scarlett, everyone here will know, but also with another IIS person, Peter Ho in Singapore, David Goldwyn in the US Energy State Department, to really help us on a regular basis, external, sort of internal, external. So these are the sort of changes we've made, and I think what's happened since the summer of 2010 has certainly been more that than that, and the ongoing issues of, like at this conference we've discussed the geostrategic positioning of states around the Ukraine event, but right at the heart of it, and I've yet to hear a discussion of it, I think Pierre Noël will go on to it tomorrow, is a question of gas, and that we're the second largest gas seller to Europe. We have production in Libya. The really big geostrategic issue that affects our industry, which I hope gets discussed tomorrow, is the question of US hydrocarbon export. Massive implications for the world, and of course for us as a big gas seller. So these are the sort of issues we've chewed on and really changed the way we've related to them quite significantly.
Marvelous, thank you very much. Andrés, Rozental, the companies with which you deal have these instincts to develop indigenous capacities to organize their thinking of geopolitical risk, or do you have different experiences?
I think we have different experiences, but one of the reasons that I moved from being a foreign service diplomat into where I am today is partly what you said. Companies now need a foreign policy. They need to do the strategic type of advice that John was talking about. I thought I would contribute with what I consider to be the 10 biggest geopolitical risks to business. So I'll start with the obvious one, which we've talked about since we started last night, which is geopolitical instability. And companies care less and less about borders, while as countries care more and more about borders. And the result is a level of geopolitical instability that hits very hard at how companies and countries interact. One of the most vivid examples that I could find of increasing geopolitical risk in terms of something that isn't on the radar screen at this meeting or today, but was in the past, is China's aggression in its maritime sphere of influence. Perceived hostility towards Vietnamese energy interests in the South China Sea ended up provoking an outburst of violence against Chinese companies in Vietnam. Japanese companies have also been adversely affected in China as a result of the Sino-Japanese dispute over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. On the other side of the globe, you have the US and the EU sanctions against Russia, which are punishment for one country's violation of another's borders. But at the end of the day, politics trumped commerce and business, and they will suffer as a result. And finally, you remember Venezuela's seizure of foreign investment assets since Chavez arrived on the scene in that country. The second risk, I think, is the cybersecurity risk. The ongoing digitization of information makes cyber threats one of the most prominent new risks to business. The cyber threat comes in 3 equally pernicious forms. Firstly, attacks designed to access valuable or confidential information. And think about the invasion of customer databases for credit card information at Target or at Home Depot. Secondly, the ideologically or politically motivated attacks against the company's reputation or its ability to provide services. We've had that problem with HSBC globally. And finally, electronic penetration by foreign or other agents for the purpose of commercial espionage. A third risk is changes in the way we use energy. The emergence of alternative sources of oil and gas is really redrawing the world's energy map. John referred to this. Soon, shale will make the US the world's largest energy exporter. And the US's resurgent position threatens to upend political and economic relationships that have been stable for decades, US-Saudi relations, for example. A pillar of the current order in the Middle East, but a threat to what is going to happen in the future. And if that pillar cracks, as some fear it will, what happens to the balance of power around the Gulf? And this is a perfect example, not just of proliferation of risk, but also of its complexity. Rebellion is the fourth. Widespread lack of public support for military force has increased the likelihood of prolonged economic combat. And it's not just Russia. Sanctions are equally prominent as a weapon, as we heard today, against Iran, where neither the US nor Israel is really prepared to neutralize an emerging nuclear capability by force. So interestingly, removing the sanctions promises to unleash its own chain reaction, a rush of foreign investors into a massive untapped market. And you can see as an example what happened in Myanmar, and look at other like that. That sort of economic stampede itself has its own implications for regional stability. Fifth, the extremism. The eruption of violence in Syria has created a training and distribution center for the spread of Islamic extremism. If you're inclined to think that companies are exempt from this particular risk, terrorism threats play havoc with business plans, delay movement of goods, services, and people. Look at the aftermath of 9/11 and ask people who are queuing at security checkpoints at airports around the world, or ask the companies operating in and around the oil fields of southern Iraq, below the area recently seized by ISIS. See how investors in Lagos feel as Boko Haram eyes a move from its traditional base in northern Nigeria, or ask the key players in the Kenyan tourist sector who are seeing their economy laid low by al-Shabaab. Sixth, corruption laws. Many companies are already worried about international corruption prosecutions. Now they also have to worry about local corruption laws. Local laws can be much more difficult to understand than international ones, and their prosecution can be much more difficult to predict. In Russia, domestic corruption investigations are used as tools for political punishment, as we've just seen. In China, they're aimed at cracking down on local excess. Both ensnare foreign companies, and the areas of focus remain familiar. Relations with local, state, and national authorities and communities, unrealistic reliance on host country political support, and hope that political stability prevails. But there are many, many imponderables and too many to foresee at the outset of any new business venture. Seventh, social unrest. As authoritarian regimes use hostile methods to quell social unrest, they almost guarantee its eventual return. Turkey's current president, Mr. Erdogan, when he was prime minister, cracked down on his own people on several occasions. His methods ranged from analog, water cannons in Gezi Park, to digital, the squelching of Twitter during a corruption investigation. And in the end, it all looked very heavy-handed, much like his reaction to the recent mining disaster in Turkey. Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro and Egypt's Abdel Fattah el-Sisi are equally potent examples of rulers who have imposed a messy and sometimes lethal brand of order on their compatriots. The result, a public pressure cooker. I'm coming to the end. Eighth, the end of growth in emerging markets. Slowing emerging market growth threatens the orgy of consumerism, which keeps the new middle class happy. And once the shopping stops, how happy are we going to be? The past 10 years has seen the development of a new global middle class that has been content to keep incumbents in office as long as the good times roll. Now that slowdowns loom, particularly in emerging markets, incumbents are under pressure to justify their existence. 9, a power vacuum. If the US doesn't want to be the world sheriff and no one else fancies the job, who's in control? Notwithstanding the effect on Americans that the recent beheadings by ISIL caused, US public sentiment remains strongly against significant foreign interventions. So who's up for the job? The UN Security Council is hobbled by its members' right to veto, And the Franco-Mexican initiative, currently being discussed again in New York during this General Assembly, to in effect supplicate the P5 to forego its veto power when the Security Council is seized with mass atrocities, is sure to be met with opposition or even derision by Russia, China, and even the US. China appears reluctant as well as currently unable to replace the US as the world's chief cop, and perhaps that's a good thing. The European Union's consensus-driven model almost disqualifies it as an efficient global crisis manager. So we're accustomed now to talking about a multipolar world which has as its core a multipolar power vacuum. Finally, the youth boom. Probably one that people don't think about very much. And although I'm not getting any younger, a vast majority of the world's population is. And the global explosion of the youth population presents risks and opportunities. Countries with growing youth populations have a source of labor, consumption, ideas, and investment. But any lapse in a country's ability to keep its youth educated, employed, healthy, and housed will lead to a challenge to the status quo. Africa is an excellent example of an entire continent undergoing a youth boom. It's also home to the majority of the world's least competitive economies. Growth rates in Africa have been impressive lately, but they'll have to stay that way to absorb the continent's bumper crop of youth. So, John, many uncertainties for business development in our very globalized world. I'm sorry I did a general tour d'horizon rather than to concentrate on specific industries.
Well, someone will ask you about Mexico,
With
I'm
both
sure,
John and Marilyn did. But prospective investors, wherever they decide to go, need to do their due diligence and understand all these risks. And even then, there are no guarantees that these 10 risks won't adversely affect their investments. Thank you.
Andrés, thank you very much. We'll take about 4 or 5 comments from the floor and then come back. The first one to catch my eye was Fleur de Villas, because she's well positioned, right opposite me, and also because she's chairman of the trustees. So, Fleur de Villas.
Thank you, John. I can claim my right. I thought that was a wonderful presentation of the problems affecting business, and also why business probably needs the advice from the IISS. But there's one particular issue which is, I'm afraid, very close to my heart. And that is that, as we all know, the Almighty has a sense of humor, and he has tended to put the world's most valuable resources into the world's most unstable countries. Whether or not one is a product or a result of the other is a question of ongoing debate. However, Western companies that involve themselves in resource exploitation in those countries face 2 problems at the moment. The one, obviously, is that for the last 20 years, the kind of regulation that you referred to, which I'm afraid I think most people in the West support, certainly I do, that would have been regarded 50, 60, 70 years ago as shackling business, does hold companies to account in the way they deal with their with any government that from whom they seek licenses. And they can't escape that accountability because it's enacted by their original governments. And they will be held to account by financial regulations and etc. However, this is not the expectation of the governments that rule the countries where they seek to invest. And there are numerous examples, and I won't give you one. I'm sure you can imagine them, particularly in parts of the world today where if companies fail to resolve or meet the wishes of the governing elite, they will shortly be dispossessed, largely by the interests of countries, not necessarily companies, who are untrammeled by those regulations and who come in and effectively offer governing elites everything that they might wish, which of course at the same time dispossesses the resident populations and adds to the instability of those countries. How Western companies, and it's not only resource companies, I think, deal with this dilemma is, I think, unresolved and is probably the biggest political risk they face, not only in Africa, but obviously and continuingly in places like Russia.
Thank you very much. First, sorry, this way, if you stand up, yeah, there you go, it's right behind you, the microphone. You have to turn, if you turn behind, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions. One is about, you know that there is a old technique now, which is a country risk. And I would like to know, with a system of metrics and rating, I would to know if you use such a technique or if you think that now such a technique is not relevant for your business. Second question, one of you mentioned that companies, especially in finance, are more and more dependent of technique of information. And there is new risk, cyber risk, and especially in finance domain with big data. I would to know how such risk is really expected, anticipated by business, and how they find to manage such risk in your own business.
Good questions. Gentleman right here, please. Yes, if you stand up. Thank you very much. And then we'll have Robert James, and then we'll have the gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. Sam Salvadure from the UK Foreign Office. Thanks very much for the presentations. I have a question about, well, I have two questions to ask. The first is, I've worked most of my career on international security issues, and risk is something we love, the sum of all our fears. I've recently been criticized and asked to look at the upside of risk, opportunities. Could you give us an example of how you try to do that kind of thing, looking at the positive side of risks? And my second question is, the way we try to look ahead at risk is something called the cone of plausibility is one of the techniques we use. The problem is situations like Ukraine fall outside the cone of plausibility. Can you give us some techniques for thinking about those unknown unknowns? Thank you very much.
Robert James.
For AIG, Mr. Hirsch, the United States did not treat you very well, but I was an owner of AIG stock, and I did not get treated very well either. So what can you do about it?
Actually, since Amos Yadlin asked for it, the microphone is there, we'll get Amos Yadlin to go.
The outgoing president of Israel is usually saying that the government in the 21st century cannot execute anything because of the political system is not adequate anymore. The budget is not there. They are all in deficit. The lawyers are not helping them. The bureaucracy is very, very slow. And the only hope for the future of the world is the international corporations. And he see Google, Amazon, all kind of these billions, hundreds of $billions companies as an organization, a social organization that can make more good in the world. What is your opinion about it?
And then right there, yes, if you
What
stand
is your
up.
limitations?
Okay, sorry. I thought.
Thank you. I'm Zahir Kazmi, former fellow at IISS. The sense that I get from the three extremely good speeches is that the reduced risk would enhance business. But whose risk? My question is that war, it seems, is sometimes a profitable business. So if there's reduced risk of war, how would, let's say, the defense industry get affected? Thank you.
And the last question, Hervé, and then we'll just ask each of the speakers to give a couple of minutes reaction to what they've heard. And
thank you. I think it was an excellent sort of scoping of risks around the world. What I'd like to hear from the panelists is whether it's all simply a matter of rapid reaction to contingencies which cannot otherwise be predicted, or how do you go about more proactively mitigating risk in the first place? I suppose the question is, we may know of the risk, but what do you do about it is more fundamental. Then secondly, related is, for example, the recent downing of MH17. It would appear as if some players in the private sector, amongst certain airlines, were aware of the dangers and others weren't. What kind of pooling of resources, perhaps you have examples of your own, can we consider in terms of the private sector banding together and addressing risk head-on? Thank you.
thank you very much. And just to elaborate on your first point about how one actually goes about mitigating political risk, I think another way of thinking about this problem from a company's perspective is that a lot of companies think political risk is something that happens to them, that they are passive actors and then some extraordinary thing happens in a country or a region, nationally or transregionally, and then they have to cope with it and they try to anticipate it to see if they can avoid it. But also a company's actions can create political risk for themselves. If a company acts artistically in a country or region, they can invite political risk against them, which otherwise might not necessarily have occurred. So I think inherent in a company's international behavior is at least do no self-harm, and then beyond that, try to ensure that others operating in the same geography don't do harm to you. But there are many examples that one could cite of companies that have created political risk for themselves because they haven't understood properly the political environment. In any case, why don't I go John Knight, Andrés Rozental, and Marilyn Hirsch in that order. A couple of minutes on what you've heard and how your companies see these things.
I'd like to address Fleur's two questions, first of all. So, Fleur, it may be that God's changed his mind because there's an awful lot of oil and gas in North America. An exceptional country. And that really only became, it was obvious to many entrepreneurs, but it only became a sort of received fact or emergent fact, I would say around 2009, 2010. And it moved from gas liquids to now to oil. It's a really major shift, and one that I hope we get to talk about tomorrow. It'll change so many things, potentially including the way Europe chooses to resolve some of the problems around Ukraine and Eastern Europe. With regard to societal proper expectations of decent and transparent access to resource, this has, of course, been as is well documented, continuous problem for natural resource industry historically. I think in a way, my company was fortunate to have, it's a slightly provocative thing to say, but I think we're fortunate to have the experience we had with something called the Horton Affair, which was about payment for access. It removed large parts of the leadership of the company. It led to oversight by the US Department of Justice of all of our business development decisions. Didn't feel very fortunate at the time, but what I think it did was to make, I speak only for my company, not others, it made us so much more robust, alert to those issues. And as I've been head of international business development since that period and more recently for the company as a whole, I can tell you with deep felt authentic commitment that our approach to that issue our doctrines, protocols, training really makes it not what it once was. It's we've not had difficulties accessing business in Latin America, Africa, Asia since 2004. We've had good, profitable businesses. We've grown internationally from about 50,000 barrels a day when we were floated to 772,000 barrels a day last week outside Norway. And without any of the sort of shenanigans you speak of since the Horton affair of 2004. So yes, it's an issue, but it can be addressed profitably. You don't have to compromise on it. With regard to cyber, this is on the risk register, tier 1 risk register of most Western intelligence services. They're very able in making that known to business. There are a lot of technical firewalls around that, but what I think is more important, certainly in my area where our information is very current and very commercially sensitive, is to make sure that the rather simple techniques of phishing and Trojans and that sort of thing, that's partly protected by firewalls and hardware, but it's mostly protected by the attitudes of staff. So over a certain period, which I won't go into, we've moved from about vulnerability of about 30% to a vulnerability of about 3% on phishing and Trojans. We've had a number of egregious attacks, and in the same way that Horton strengthened us, I would say that those attacks strengthened us as well. I'll leave my remarks at that for now.
Thank you. Andrés Rozental, comment on what you heard briefly, but I need to ask you a specific question. What are the mistakes that international companies investing in Mexico typically make, and what are the concerns they typically have that you find you have to disabuse them of because there are other concerns they should be having?
Actually, I was going to answer Fleur's comment with an example from Mexico. We have 250 Canadian mining companies operating in Mexico, mainly in the gold and silver area. Canadian mining companies are equally involved in most of Latin American countries that have mining resources. They have the worst record of complying with local environmental laws, with community relationships, with the use of explosives. And at one point, the Canadian Parliament decided that it wanted to pass a law to control the activities of Canadian companies abroad. The Canadian companies lobbied so successfully that the law was never passed. And Canada, which is not a developing country, obviously, has a real serious problem of its image because it is unable to control its mining industry outside of Canada, and I'd say even sometimes within Canada. I think the answer to your question, John, is that the two risks or the two areas in which companies generally don't think about in the early stages until it's too late, and then it's remedial rather than preventive, is in the environmental sphere and in community relations. And that's not just in the mining industry, it's almost in all industries. And investments tend to deal with these issues generally as a secondary priority. Another example I wanted to give very quickly to our colleague who asked about country risk. About 10 years ago, ArcelorMittal decided that it was going to move towards self-sufficiency in iron ore deposits. And so we started scouring around the world where we could get iron ore. And one of the places we found was Liberia. Liberia has very large deposits of iron ore that at that point were not exploited and were not in concessions abroad. And one of the tasks that I and colleagues on the board of ArcelorMittal at the time had to deal with was how risky was it to go to Liberia to sign an agreement with the then Liberian government to get a concession for the iron ore, knowing that the government was going to change. And in effect, we signed the concession, the government changed, the new president of Liberia decided to cancel the concession because she insisted that it had been obtained under, shall we say, questionable circumstances, which was not the case. And we had to spend 2 years litigating in Liberia to get the concession back, which we did, and she finally apologized for having doubted us. That type of country risk analysis is typical, I think, in many companies. I give you this example because it's one that I was directly involved with. And finally, in the banking sector, and I assume it's the same in the insurance sector, we do mitigate risk. Many of you might have seen the statement by the chairman of HSBC not very long ago, the global chairman of HSBC, about the number of people and the amount of money that is being spent to mitigate against money laundering and financial crime. It's huge. But it happened after the fact. It happened after things happened that led to fines, monitoring, and other things. But there is mitigation, Hervé, and I think that there probably is in other fields as well, but I think the banking is particularly one in which there's an enormous amount of money and effort being placed in mitigation.
Many thanks. Marilyn Hirsch?
I'm going to touch on a couple of different themes. You know, when you think about global growth, right? Because we're a public company, so when you think about global growth, we follow where a lot of the risk in the world is. And, you know, that's sort of the business that we're in. And every day we have to make choices in underwriting risks in our core business. And so underwriting fundamentally risk from a bunch of different perspectives is what we have to excel at. That's actually the thing that we have to know how to do really, really, really well and be willing to get it wrong sometimes. So when I think about global growth trends over the next 10 to 20 years, someone asked a question about you know, stabilizing and how business can be a force for good. Insurance is around to help people when bad things happen. And when you look at the lack of really good health care in so many places around the world that governments are having trouble providing, when you look at an inability to actually continue helping people with social safety nets, life insurance becomes incredibly valuable. How we as an industry and individually companies come up with solutions that are affordable is a trick to helping stability. And you know, it's not trivial, like when you try to say you actually try to help people. But the trick will actually be, as I said, in places where there's inherent instability, and insurance actually tries to help create either economic stability, either at a macro level or for individuals. So that's, I think, the challenge for us as an industry for the next 10 to 20 years.
Many thanks. I might not be certain of the exact number, but I think 41 countries were mentioned in the last hour as we discussed geopolitical risk. It might have been 42 or 39. I was trying to make scores. So that gives you an impression from just 3 individuals, animated by you, how wide-ranging these problems are. But I think what we've also shown today is why the ISS is determined to ensure we have this co-equal cooperation in our analysis between government experts and the business community. And we've learned a huge amount from the way in which you've invited us to frame these geopolitical questions. So we want the ISS to continue to have this strong dialogue with business along with the experts and government officials that we bring together. Could you please thank in the usual way the 3 business leaders we have on the podium today for thinking about geopolitical risk in a slightly different way, and I look forward to continuing my conversation with you over dinner. Many thanks.